Cool. Thank you so much. So, for today's session, we're talking about tackling language around unhealthy masculinities, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Imran Manzoor. He is the founder of the only accredited therapy service specializing in supporting South Asian men and boys who have experienced abuse in childhood. Imran is also a trainer specialist in masculinity and race. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think my first question for you would be, what do we mean by unhealthy masculinities, and how would you define language that surrounds masculinity? Like, I'm guessing, giving some examples.
Okay, so let me prefix this by saying I'm certainly, although I say I'm a trainer, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this subject matter. And the reason I'd say I'm not is because I exclusively work with Black and Asian men. So my experiences of masculinity are limited to that. That's not to say that I'm not aware or engaged with the wider literature, but it certainly isn't any kind of field of expertise. So what I would say is there is this thing called masculinity. It's far more openly discussed now than it ever has been. And there's no one clear definition of what it is exactly. So theorists instead talk about masculinities. It's unclear what the point is sometimes in some of the conversation, but one thing becomes abundantly clear, and that is that there's one form of masculinity that we would call hegemonic masculinity. And it's that form of masculinity against which all other forms of masculinity might be measured. And this is a form of masculinity that men take so seriously that often they're willing to resort to violence to uphold it. Whether or not it's simply the masculinity or the preservation of culture or the preservation of religious tradition or something else is something we can discuss. So according to the APA, so the American Psychological Association, they famously said, I'm going to take it, I've got it on their website, boys live under intensified pressure to display gender-appropriate behaviors according to an ideal man code. So that's what they might call hegemonic masculinities. Now, all complicated and a bit of a mouthful. Really what they mean are these things. Restrict emotion. Avoid being feminine. Be non-relational. Objectify sex. Be homophobic. Focus on toughness and aggression. Be self-reliant and make achievement your top priority. So these are things that perhaps people might consider to be rules of masculinity that men, not always men, interestingly, but for the most part, men pass on to other generations. I say not only men, because what were they called? The white feather. They were a section of the suffragettes who would call out the cowardice of men dressed in civilian gear at the advent of World War I for being cowards, for not going in those PALS units to be blown to bits. So this was women essentially policing masculinity at this point. So there's a lot there. There's a lot in that. But one thing is really the main undercurrent that you find, or the underbelly, is homophobia, misogyny, this idea of asserting control and dominance over people. And the bits that become quite toxic, if those things aren't toxic enough, is this struggle to be vulnerable, the struggle to see vulnerability in others, or when you see it, to call it out as somehow being akin to being homosexual, and a fear of showing weakness. Now, that's something I see in my clients all the time, and it's abundantly clear that that acts in some way to police how they behave. Now, because I work with victims of abuse, when they see those rules of masculinity, they decipher from that I'm no longer a man. All of those rules of masculinity for me have been violated. So I'm now stripped of my masculinity. Now think about it. Think about the very hypersexualized language that's used to demean other men. It's always references to female genitalia. So men are being stripped as if all the masculinity is stripped from them, and all that's reduced, all that remains is somehow female genitalia, which is an interesting and quite a toxic behavior, I think. especially when we think about violence towards women and girls. It seems that the only emotions that men can show, therefore, are anger and lust. Those are acceptable emotions. But anything else, and again, you step out of the realm of heterosexuality. I guess what I'd like you to consider, though, is if you're not a white man in Britain, how might that change? So what we find is that men who are not white don't feel that they're measured against the standards of masculinity, and they come up short. So therefore, they become parodies of masculinity. So the muscles, the cars, the clothes, whatever it is, it's some kind of parody of masculinity because, well, frankly, they're stripped of the right, whether it's in their altercation with the police or the education system or whatever it is, they feel that they're stripped of that dignity or the right to call themselves masculine. So they become this kind of often hilarious parody of it, but incredibly unhealthy. Some of the things that men have talked to us about, just some quotes from our users, it's a white man's world. If I share this, I'm stripped of all remnants of masculinity. Another client said, I feel like I'm a man. I feel like I shouldn't be in this position. I'm not a man, I'm a mouse trapped by a cat. Such basety, which is the stripping of one's dignity. I'm a strapping man, no one gives me any trouble. And then repeatedly, I've been robbed of honor. Now, that is obviously a particular form of violation in childhood. So what we find in psychotherapy is that men do the following. They hide their private experiences. They maintain control throughout. They're not going to hand over control. That's quite a difficult process. Intimacy is required in a therapeutic relationship. They're not used to any kind of intimacy that isn't sexualized. Of course, this isn't all men. These are the men who are accessing our service. They must show strength. So if we ever have a group session, there's other men there, there's lots of posturing, lots of talk about how much they can lift, or, their, sort of notches on the bedpost, shall we say. There's an act of invincibility. However, there's other things too. One thing becomes apparent, and I want you to consider whether or not these things are terrible or even bad. Being self-reliant, being stoic, endlessly persisting, carrying on through. Now, there's lots of evidence to show that actually counseling doesn't work very well for men. Traditional forms of counseling just aren't working very well for men, and it's to do with the way that men process information and what men would like to get from counseling. But again, that's something I'll cover as we go on. So some of those things are quite powerful and quite useful. So what I'd say is, I think one of your question goes on to ask about, well, what can we change? How can we change in our language? Well, let's think about the positive aspects and healthy aspects of masculinity. Well, providing for those in his care, even if that's a cultural trait, it's quite a nice trait. That's certainly not a mean trait. Protecting those you love, to be brave, to be determined, to be chivalrous. I accept that that's something that's a little old-fashioned now, perhaps in Western culture, but certainly in other communities, that's something, it shows a level of respect for women.
Yeah.
So again, maybe not all aspects of masculinity are toxic. The question is posited as if, to discuss the more harmful aspects of it, but perhaps masculinity has some positives, and maybe we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And maybe that's why we're losing men. So what I say is, instead of calling it toxic masculinity, let's call it limiting masculinity. And I mentioned this because last year, the American Psychology Association issued guidelines for the treatment of men and boys. And what they said in this edict was that traditional masculinity, all of it was harmful. all aspects of it, and that it compromised the mental health of men and boys, and it presents a social danger, and that men are socialized into masculinity by their fathers.
Mm.
Can you think of a hole in that logic?
Yeah, no, I think especially at the beginning when you kind of just touched on, like, even from like the suffragettes, for example, and things, how there's so many different people that come into play when it comes to using specific types of language. I'd love you to touch more on specific examples of the type of language that both, fathers or mothers or any kind of extended family or like people in society, what they can use to, which does do like harm in your definition of.
Well, I'd say this language very specifically here by the American Psychology Association that was going to be adopted by the British Psychology Association is incredibly harmful. Why? Because the biggest indicator of long-term delinquency, criminality, antisocial behavior is living in a house without a father. So there's an inherent contradiction there. If it's men that are socializing men into this kind of behavior, if it's fathers specifically, if we're claiming that they're socializing into these kind of pathological behaviors, then why is it that the most pathological behavior is coming from those households where there is no father figure?
Yeah. So
I guess that's part of, the language that we're using that I think is undermining young men. 76% according to the Prison Reform Trust, 76% of all inmates last year lived in a home without a father. So clearly, there's fairly devastating consequences. The Institute for Family Studies said last year that the lacking of day-to-day involvement, guidance, and positive examples of the father in the home and the financial advantages associated with having him in the household means that these boys are more likely to act up, to lash out, to flounder in school, and fail at work as they move into adolescence and adulthood. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe toxic masculinity in itself is actually harming boys. Maybe the notion, the way that we use the language, the way that we describe it is harmful to boys, men and boys.
And I guess would you say, so like kind of the language that not only, I guess, in society that we use, but also I guess language that maybe in the, as you mentioned, the medical system or things like that, how they both aspects, even if they're the same or different, have different effects, how would like affect young people who are male or identifiers?
Well, I think constantly being told, I can only speak to the context of the men who I work with, but constantly being told that there was something inherently backwards about your culture and your tradition, that it was patriarchal, which it is, but it's patriarchal to such an extent that it's harmful to women, that you are somehow inherently a danger to women. We have educators coming into school and telling kids as young as 10 that they're potential rapists. It's wholesale, so it's across the board. Now, anybody who has studied the prevent agenda knows that they literally, well, it was supposed to be Muslim kids, but it was pretty much anyone who was non-white. And then they extended it into, sort of working class white males as well. And now it's finally, all these years later, extended into all young people. But for a long time, we were only focusing on one community. And what was the consensus as a consequence of that? That Muslims embodied threat in the public consciousness. So it's harmful. It's harmful. Imagine what it does to the psyche of those individuals. Imagine what it does to the well-being of those individuals. How do you go and get help if you think somehow that you're inherently toxic, that you're tyrannical, that you're going to go out there and cause harm in the world? Now, of course, there's men out there who are incredibly harmful. We can think of one very, very obvious one, Andrew Tate, who, huge mass following now. But we have to ask the question of why. Why do these men get that kind of following? What is, if you were to ask an AI program to do a cartoon of sort of pathological, narcissistic, predatory behavior, it would draw a cartoon of Andrew Tate, right? I'm not sure if you need to edit that name out or if I'm allowed to say that without someone coming after OAC, but you know, and this is what's becoming attractive. And I think Trumpism was a big influence in that, because Trump is selfish and he's not ashamed of it. And he says, I'm not going to judge you, be what you want. I'm not going to judge you because I'm incapable of judging myself. So, you know, it's shameless narcissism, it's shameless, you know, self-flagellation. So, and that's sort of garnered appeal at a time when we were supposed to be becoming far more progressive. So I'm not saying it's a direct consequence of us using terms like toxic masculinity, but I do believe it's played a role. These men feel that it's a siege somehow, and their backs are against the wall, and therefore they bounce to the more extreme opinion.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you for touching on that. And I think also on the different figures and like male figures in that are like kind of on the rise in society. And I mean, I guess how do you think that having these type of figures like affects like limited masculinity or unhealthy masculinities? Like if it kind of does it probe it more, or like what kind of do you think it sets us back? Like what's kind of your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I can tell you this, that a man called John Barry this year did a piece of research. It was only 4,000 men, but what he found was that thinking masculinity is bad for your behavior is linked to having worse mental health. 85% of respondents thought the term toxic masculinity was insulting, a pejorative now, and probably harmful to boys and men. These same young men, this was the same research where these young men spoke about educators coming into the school and young kids as young as 10 being taught about toxic masculinity, and that they were somehow, you know, predatory rapists in waiting. And that's you know, probably exaggeration. I'm sure that's not what the educators were saying, but that's the message that they're gleaning from that. And I think that's a problem. And I think, you know, we need to put things in context, you know, in terms of violence. The vast majority of people who are disaffected, or a huge proportion of men, most people in prisons are men. 70%, 76% of young men in prison. As I shared earlier, you know, fatherless homes. Most homeless people are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. Boys do worse in school than young women. Men work longer hours in more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to work outside. So for those men, they will use those arguments to say, well, so where's the dominance? Where is the dominance exactly? What is this tyrannical patriarchy that I'm part of, or that I'm collaborating in? Which, you know, by the same token, they'll say about white supremacy, and I think they've got a valid argument. You know, where is the supremacy in me being white? So you know, it's interesting. It's interesting, and we need to contextualize it better, I think. So clearly we need to stop men being told to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, that they would just get better if they were less toxic, or toxically, or have less masculine toxicity. Is that the word? That's the word I'm looking for. Or that, you know, you're not going to flourish unless you're somehow a tyrant. Now, don't get me wrong, nobody's going out there and saying those words specifically, of course not. But because of the kind of this kind of omnipresence of social media, that's the message they're being informed. And the way the algorithms work, that's the message they're constantly going to be informed.
I guess how would you suggest what like alternative language to use from the current language that we're using, in terms of, I guess, the current approach to like trying to tackle like unhealthy language or alternative language? Like how would you suggest we stray?
So the use of limiting masculinity rather than toxic would be a good one. But I think also to draw upon and talk about the strengths of masculinity, to talk about those positives that people can draw from masculinity. So confidence, strength, you know, that those masculine qualities women possess too. Yeah, you know, they're not exclusive to men, but they're allegedly, according to the research, those are so-called male brain activities. But that those things are embodied in all of us, and they need to be encouraged in all of us. And you know, that it's good perhaps to be chivalrous, or that it is good to be brave, and that you know, those things are admirable qualities that men have. You know, and they don't need to be demeaned, perhaps. that they just need a healthier discussion and to talk about the fact that women can possess those qualities too. And some of the qualities that women have, men probably should absorb too, whether it's empathy or being agreeable, those acts of kindness, those are positive qualities that we develop without minimizing the fact that, okay, yeah, masculinity means something and you are a man and you're not stripped of that.
That sounds amazing. And I think, how do you think these changes can impact those who identify as men, or just men in general? How do you think using those different approaches and maybe trying to integrate different types of masculinity or femininity, how do you think changing that would make an impact for the future, especially for younger
generation? You mean how do we, in this sector, in the work that we're doing?
Yes, I mean, all of the examples that you just mentioned, about how we can change and use alternative language, how do you think this could impact men in the future if we were to adopt it?
I mean, fundamentally, we don't have contact with with society, do we? The way that perhaps social media and I think YouTube, I think there's about 3% of creators do all the videos on YouTube. And I think it's even less than that on, what's the Chinese one called? Not Instagram. TikTok, that's the one. So, that kind of force is what you're up against. But if we start using language that, doesn't demean, then I'm hopeful. I mean, we try to do it. We've adopted it in the work that we do. And I think men take to it. How the wider sector does it, I don't know to what extent the wider sector is engaging men. Because the one thing I do see is there's a sincere or a severe lack of engagement with men. I do a lot of perpetrator work, violence against women and girls, and engaging perpetrators is very difficult. Because for the most part, they don't think they're guilty of anything. So perhaps this kind of language needs to filter down, or perhaps it doesn't in that particular sector, because these are men who are engaging in extremely harmful behaviors and putting the lives of women at risk. But I think we can certainly all do more, and we just removing things like toxicity or male privilege or white male privilege, I think is a good start.
And do you think for maybe secondary school, boys or things like that, or maybe young adults, how do you think this could impact them and maybe the way they view themselves or their mental health if we start to shift our perspective, and even as just in the way that we speak?
Well, I don't know to the extent of which, or the extent to which schools are, or what kind of language schools are using. But if a young person believes that everything I do, any ambition I have, is somehow tyrannical and only contributes towards the further suppression of the rights of others, you can lead to quite a defeatist mentality, can't you? If they internalize that mindset. So I think we have to continue challenging harmful behaviors, but it's where we categorize all male behaviors as toxic, or all white behaviors as symptomatic of privilege. That's where we start as people, I think. And I think we are in danger of severely, certainly I think the left are losing the not only the moral high ground, but I think they're losing I think they're significantly out of touch with reality and what people really think. And I think it's incredibly harmful, if I'm honest.
And for you, have you noticed that when you've kind of worked with boys and men on helping to shift that perspective on masculinity, do you find their mental health is better, or have you found a shift in that?
I mean, we don't use so what I will say is, working with perpetrators, yes, they don't feel that as soon as they walk in, they're under siege, that everything about them is toxic and harmful, and everything about them is terrible. But actually, we're separating you as a person from the behaviors, and we think fundamentally you want to be a decent person, but these are the behaviors you've got to address. And some of them may be rooted in harmful masculinities, but not all masculinity is harmful. Actually, engaging in harmful behaviors in an intimate relationship is contrary to masculinity. It's contrary to chivalrous behavior, for example. We're going old school here, right? We're using language that is quite archaic, but it helps. It helps. It improves engagement.
Yeah, that's thank you. That was a really insightful discussion to see the different effects on masculinity, and also how to, I guess, change the language you use around it. So yeah, I was wondering if anyone had any questions to ask Imran, anything like that. More about the discussion opening to what you kind of think about it all.